Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here again with you in this new edition of PHYSIS School. This is going to be our spring school, our PHYSIS Spring School 2020, where Gary Rosenkrantz will deliver the PHYSIS lectures in Analytic Metaphysics 2020 in the spring edition on substances and facts. And the first title of his talk is going to be An Epistemology for Systematic Ontology. So when you feel ready, Gary.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here today to speak to all of you about ontology, and in particular, ontology and the theory of knowledge. I see that actually the department or the unit here is on metaphysics and the theory of knowledge, so this should fit in well. Ontology seeks to provide an inventory and general characterization of all things real. Ontological categories are highly general classifications of what is real, what could be real, or what may be real as far as we know, depending on one's philosophical purpose and the context. A historical sample of categories includes substance or individual things, property, relation, space, time, event, boundary, absence, collection, and state of affairs, or fact. One cannot know a priori what categories of entities are real. For example, although I may know for certain that I exist, I cannot ascertain a priori whether I'm a body, a mind, etc. In a similar vein, being acquainted with some taste sensation is one thing, and determining its ontological character is another. The second is a greater epistemic achievement than the first. And although one knows a priori that sphericity is a shape, that 2 + 2 = 4, and so on, one cannot determine the ontological status of shapes and numbers simply by making deductive inferences from propositions known a priori. Ontology is difficult. Both empirical and a priori considerations are relevant. Both deductive and non-deductive reasoning is needed. The difficulty of ontology suggests that ontological preferences are not wholly subjective. Ontologies are contestable and frequently contested. Quine famously stated that he preferred, quote unquote, desert landscapes, thereby endorsing ontological minimalism. Meinong, an ontological maximalist, notoriously preferred a veritable jungle of entities. The disparity between them is wide, leaving considerable latitude for moderate views. I'm not fond of desert landscapes or jungles. Monism entails that everything is of one ontological category. On less extreme versions, all metaphysically basic or irreducible entities are of one such category. Additional non-basic or reducible categories of entities are subsumed under or explained by basic or irreducible entities. For example, according to simple materialism, everything's a body. On less extreme versions, all metaphysically basic or irreducible entities are bodies. Additional non-basic or reducible categories of entities are subsumed under or explained by bodies. Other monisms include substantialism, eventism, factualism, and structuralism. A metaphysically basic category of entity is irreducible and explanatorily basic. Perhaps some irreducible categories of entities are not metaphysically basic due to their insufficient explanatory power. The relevant notions of ontological reduction and metaphysical explanation will be elucidated later, and by later I mean tomorrow in my next paper. According to pluralism, there are two or more basic or irreducible categories. For example, categories of substances, properties, relations, facts, events, boundaries, what have you. Can ontologies like those advanced by monists or pluralists be epistemically justified? Or are competing ontologies of these kinds the product of fundamental aesthetic disagreements? Is freewheeling ontology permissible, or does ontology need to be tethered? And if so, how? Ontology is not of much value unless it is carried out in a principled way using correct methods. Best practices in ontology should conform with epistemic norms set forth in a satisfactory epistemology of ontology. The epistemology of ontology has been neglected by ontologists and epistemologists alike. If my efforts towards codifying such an epistemology have any merit, it's because I stand on the shoulders of three giants: Aristotle, G.E. Moore, and Roderick Chisholm. Quine is also worthy of mention. His classic paper on what there is revealing both for what it mentions and for what it leaves out. Quine rightly highlights ontological paraphrase as a method for eliminating apparent reference to entities of various kinds. He connects this method to his criterion of ontological commitment, according to which a theory is committed to entities of a certain kind just when it quantifies over them. But Quine ignores questions about the epistemic justification of ontological claims. Commitments are neither necessary nor sufficient for epistemic justification. We may quantify over incredible entities and fail to quantify over credible ones. Indeed, Quine argues that traditional epistemology is dead and should be supplanted by naturalized epistemology, an empirical study of cognitive processes unconcerned with epistemic justification. I will argue that traditional epistemology can provide a satisfactory account of the credibility or epistemic justification of ontological beliefs. I begin with two questions. Are there intrinsically credible ontological beliefs? If there are such beliefs, what makes them intrinsically credible? A credible ontological belief is either intrinsically credible or is justified by another credible belief upon which it is based. If every such belief is justified by another belief, then there must be either an infinite sequence of basing beliefs or a circular sequence of basing beliefs. None of us can have an infinite number of basing beliefs because of our finite prior existence in conjunction with our finite cognitive capacity at a time. A circular sequence of basing beliefs is precluded by its vicious nature. One alternative to an infinite or circular sequence of basing beliefs is substantive foundationalism. Assuming this theory, any sequence of human basing beliefs comes to an end. That stopping place is a belief that is intrinsically credible in virtue of being either an observational belief, a memory belief, or an a priori belief. Another account is coherentism, the theory that a belief is intrinsically credible in virtue of its belonging to a highly coherent set of beliefs, such that every belief in the set is credible in virtue of the set's overall coherence. However, coherentism faces a serious problem. Ernest Sosa calls it detachment from reality. So imagine a hermit, a mathematical genius, obsessed with number theory. Despite having normally functioning sense organs, he abandons all his perceptual beliefs and comes to believe that only arithmetical entities exist, forming in the process a highly coherent set of beliefs consisting of that belief together with his numerous necessarily true arithmetical beliefs, like 1 and 1 is 2, and 6 is a perfect number, and so on and so forth. Consequently, according to coherentism, the hermit is justified in believing that only arithmetical entities exist simply in virtue of that belief's belonging to a highly coherent set of beliefs, despite his discordant perceptual experiences of a physical world. This consequence is quite unacceptable for an epistemology of ontology. Coherentism, then, is not an adequate epistemology for ontological investigations. I shall propose an alternative epistemology of ontology, a modest version of substantive foundationalism. One leading idea is that ontology is founded on observational and memory beliefs which have ontological content. These foundational beliefs have intrinsic prima facie credibility. Another leading idea is that our culture has a single ordinary common sense or folk conceptual scheme which has certain ontological presuppositions. I refer to these ontological presuppositions as our folk ontology. This folk ontology is rather robust. It presupposes the reality of a variety of entities, such as individual things, properties, relations, volumes of space, lengths of time, events, states of affairs, boundaries, absences, and collections, among others. Moreover, people in our culture typically believe themselves to observe individual things, living and non-living, properties, for example, colors and shapes, spatial and temporal relations, for example, between, on, earlier than, later than, volumes of space, lengths of time, events, states of affairs, surfaces, wholes, shadows, collections, all sorts of things. Entities of these kinds are commonly believed to be accessible to observation, perceptual or reflective. Analyzing the natures of such entities is a task for subsequent theoretical inquiry. So I'm saying we have perceptual access to these things, but we don't necessarily know exactly what their natures are. That can be decided later. I propose the following epistemic principle concerning the credibility of ontological beliefs. So this is the first thing on your handout here. The belief that there exists an instance of a putative ontological category C has prima facie credibility within a culture K when it's commonplace within K for people to believe themselves to observe or to believe themselves to recall observing instances of C, where, given K's folk ontology, these ostensibly observed instances are typical instances of C. This principle neither countenances nor precludes the possibility of foundational non-observational access to entities of some kind. For example, mathematical entities, moral properties, a divine being, and so on. I'm just not talking about whether or not there is such other kinds of access. I'm only concerned with the kind that we generally all agree on, which is observational access. Others have spoken of intuition and all kinds of other things. Few, if any of us, take ourselves to observe numbers or moral properties, for that matter. Observing that there are 2 cats on the mat is tantamount to observing that there exists an X, there exists a Y, X is a cat on the mat, and Y is a cat on the mat, and X is other than Y. To do so is not to observe the number 2. Hence, a belief in the reality of abstract numbers lacks observational initial credibility. Likewise for a belief in the reality of moral qualities, unexemplifed properties, and so on. So we don't have observational access to those specific sorts of things. But we do have it with respect to, say, the color green. We see that things are green. We see the things that are green. We see the relations between one green thing and another green thing, that it's beside another green thing. So we have observational access to all of that. B.L. Worf hypothesized that different cultures may have different folk ontologies in virtue of possessing different languages, expressing different conceptual schemes. Since my epistemic principle relativizes the prima facie credibility of an ontological belief to a culture, that epistemology is consistent with Worf's hypothesis. Nevertheless, I presuppose that ontological beliefs are beliefs about what sorts of entities exist absolutely, and not merely beliefs about what sorts of entities exist relative to some conceptual scheme. According to Quine's doctrines of the indeterminacy of translation and the inscrutability of reference, people in one cultural linguistic group cannot nail down the ontological content of utterances made by people in another sufficiently disconnected cultural linguistic group. For example, English speakers cannot tell whether Gavagai in Arunta means rabbit, undetached rabbit part, or rabbit stages, and so on. These doctrines are compatible with the epistemic principles set forth earlier. Indeed, the indeterminacy of translation and the inscrutability of reference suggest that an ontologist belonging to a given culture has little choice but to begin with an examination of the folk ontology of his or her culture, if, as Quine's argument suggests, it is the sole folk ontology whose ontological content he or she can nail down. Given my proffered epistemic principle, beliefs in the reality of inanimate objects, living things, properties, relations, volumes of space, lengths of time, events, states of affairs, boundaries, absences, and collections are prima facie credible. Belief in the reality of such entities is credible so long as this presumption is not defeated. Members of our culture who deny their reality have the burden of defeating their presumptive credibility. The prima facie credibility of such a belief in the instantiation of a category C is defeated just when there are grounds for doubting its truth. Specifically, the prima facie credibility of one's belief in the instantiation of a category C is defeated if either, and then I give you 5 defeaters, which are on your handout there, Roman numerals 1 through 5. So the first defeater is that one has grounds to doubt that C is coherent. The second is that one has grounds to doubt that C is cognitively significant. The third is that one has reason to believe that C is a category of negative entity. The fourth is that one has scientific grounds to doubt that C is instantiated. And the fifth is that one has reason to believe that any truth ostensibly referring to an instance of C can be paraphrased into a necessarily equivalent truth which does not refer to an instance of C, and which ostensibly refers to an entity only if it is an instance of some other credible category. Are additional defeaters needed? Is our lack of a criterion of identity for instances of C a defeater? Not if some entities have primitive identity. And it is difficult to see how to exclude this possibility. Yet, if primitive identity is shown to be impossible, and it appears that instances of C lack a criterion of identity, then there are grounds to doubt that C is coherent. and the prima facie credibility of belief in instances of C is defeated by 1. So that's covered. Evidence that some ontologists in our culture deny C's instantiation, and there's a lot of that going around, right? We all deny each other as ontological. That's not a defeater. That said, if such an ontologist provides one with grounds to doubt that C is instantiated, per 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, the credibility of one's belief in C's instantiation is defeated. So they got to give you a good reason. Their mere denial is not a reason. It's got to be backed up, and the quality of their reasoning is what's important. Concerning 1 and 2, so doubts about coherence or cognitive significance. Some inconsistencies are hidden. Even Frege missed that his conception of a set was incoherent until Russell pointed it out. Berkeley argued that talk of bodies is nonsensical or entails a contradiction. The third defeater embodies the intuitively appealing idea that on reflection, a putative entity whose reality derives from the unreality of one or more other entities is peculiar. Absences, negative properties, negative states of affairs, for example, all of these are ontologically suspect. Suppose that the prima facie credibility of one's belief in an instance of a category C was defeated by 3 alone. Okay, that's the negative, that is a negative entity. Suppose we come to suspect that our belief in shadows is in question, suspect, because a shadow is just an absence of light. So it's defeated just by that condition alone, or by 5 alone. So that would be where we can paraphrase it away. Okay. Maybe talk about shadows is paraphrasable as talk about shadowed objects. So instead of saying there's a shadow, we can just say there's a shadowed object. Or just by both of these. So shadows are negative, and we can paraphrase them away. Okay. But subsequently, a truth surfaces that makes apparent reference to such a thing, which one has reason to believe cannot be paraphrased away. Suppose we find some more complicated example than just there's a shadow on the wall. In that case, the prima facie credibility is going to be restored. So if you can find some example you can't paraphrase away, then shadows might become, belief in shadows might become justified again. Consequently, the prima facie credibility of an observational belief in an absence might possibly be restored. Only the future can tell. But at this point, since they're negative, we have doubts about them even though we observe them. 4 concerns the tension between the manifest and the scientific images. When well-grounded scientific ideas contradict folk ontological conceptions, the latter conception should be brought into conformity with the former ideas. The following imperatives guide such conceptual change. They also direct attention toward the conceptual data needed for philosophical analyses of our proto-folk ontological concepts and their descendants. Okay, so we have a folk ontological concept of a living thing, and then we have descendants of that, which might be enhanced by biological insights that we have, that certain living things are based on organic chemistry and so on. When a coherent folk ontological conception, Z, of the nature of instances of a folk ontological category, C, entails that every such instance is phi, then cleave to Z, stick with Z, unless you get clear and convincing scientific reasons to believe that some such instances are not phi, or to believe that every such instance is psi, where psi is incompatible with phi. When one has such reasons, abandon Z or revise it so that it no longer entails that every instance of the category is phi, and when appropriate, revise it so that it entails that every instance of C is psi. For example, our folk conceptions of space and time entail their mutual independence. If one has clear and convincing scientific reasons to believe that there is a four-dimensional space-time continuum, one's folk conceptions of space and time should be revised accordingly. However, others argue that space and time consist of discrete atoms having a diameter of the Planck length and a duration of the Planck time. Such granularity entails that space and time are neither indefinitely divisible nor mathematically continuous. If we had clear and convincing scientific reasons for believing in granular space and time, it would behoove us to adopt the conception of the nature of space and time compatible with that belief. Proponents of granular space and time appeal to the scientifically confirmed premise that a length or duration less than the Planck length or time is not measurable. For their argument to be deductively valid, the following positivistic premise is needed. Reality requires measurability. But science seems committed to the reality of entities, some of whose properties are not measurable. Entities such as the Big Bang, dark matter, and the interior of a black hole beyond its event horizon. Thus, the requisite positivistic premise is problematic. In a related vein, additional categories of theoretical entities inspired by the a priori or empirical sciences may be credibly added to our stock of credible categories via inference to the best explanation. So these might be categories like sets, numbers, space-time, fields, and so on. The explanatory virtue of parsimony provides the main motivation for defeater 5, the paraphrase away maneuver. This explanatory virtue is generally expressed in terms of Occam's razor, the methodological injunction to not multiply entities unnecessarily. Put another way, Occam's razor asserts that all else being equal, the simplest theory is best. Clearly, Occam's razor does not require simplicity at any price. If it did, the best theory would be absolute nihilism, the absurd theory that nothing whatsoever exists, that it's false that there exists an X such that X is identical with X. That's the simplest theory. After all, the minimal number of entities that you could have is 0. According to a first reading of Occam's razor, one should not multiply the number of entities belonging to a given kind unless it's necessary to account for the data. For example, all else equal, positing a finite number of entities of some category is epistemically preferable to positing an infinite number of entities of that category. One should not accept an infinite number of entities of some category unless the data requires them. A second reading of Occam's razor is that one should not recognize more irreducible kinds or categories than necessary to account for the data. For instance, a nominalist might propose that red is a color can be paraphrased as whatever is red is colored. So 1 can be paraphrased as 2. The two statements are necessarily equivalent. But it seems by this paraphrase we've eliminated apparent reference to the abstract universals, red and color, in favor of reference to concrete entities, red items and colored items. Instead of positing both concrete and abstract entities, only concrete entities need be positive. So the nominalists can be happy. So far, so good. However, proposed paraphrases may be rejected when they rely on questionable, non-standard linguistic expressions. For example, Hawthorne and Coherence propose that the cat is here now. So suppose we've got this cat, like right here. The cat is here now. They say this can be paraphrased as, so the cat is here now. Can be paraphrased, they say, as it catteth here now, thereby eliminating apparent reference to a substantial individual in favor of reference to an event. They favor the idea that substances can be eliminated in favor of localized excitations in the quantum field. Their paraphrase relies on the non-standard expression catteth, modeled on archaic forms of the English verbs like raineth, which means it rains in Old English. At best, the meaning of catteth is obscure. At worst, it's gibberish. A plausible paraphrase would not essentially depend on the use of such a monstrous noun-verb hybrid. Moreover, catteth seems incoherent insofar as necessarily a substance, for example, Felix the cat, cannot be said to occur. Felix doesn't occur, he exists. And necessarily an event, for example, Felix's life, a cat's life, occurs. So events occur and substances do not occur. Plausibly, the use of catteth commits what Gilbert Ryle called a category mistake. Another example is the number 7 is smiling. One might as well propose to paraphrase that particle is here now as it particleth here now. The proposed paraphrase is meritless and suggests a desire to reap the advantages of theft over honest toil, as Russell once observed in another context. My reference to Bertrand Russell here is somewhat ironic, though. Russell penned the following passage: "A piece of matter which we took to be a single persistent entity is really a string of entities, like the apparently persistent objects in the cinema. And there is no reason why we should not say the same of a mind. The persistent ego seems as fictitious as the permanent atom. Both are only strings of events having certain interesting relations to each other." It is unclear whether there is a significant difference between Russell's position in this passage on the ontological status of substance and the position of Hawthorne and Coherence. Though unlike them, Russell does not seek to defend such a position by appealing to monstrous noun-verb hybrids. The moral here is that defeat of the prima facie credibility of ontological beliefs via paraphrase remains viable, but only to the extent that the paraphrases do not essentially depend on the employment of dubious linguistic monsters. Another example of a similar sort arises within the context of a deflationary substance ontology. Such an ontology maintains that, strictly speaking, only fundamental particles are real. Hence, every putative compound substance, including every living organism, is unreal. In defense of this claim, it may be proposed that our apparent reference to compound substances is eliminable in favor of reference to basic particles. For instance, it may be proposed that Trump is the president can be paraphrased as basic particles in space-time are four-dimensionally arranged. Trump is the president-wise. But because this proposal introduces an adjectival or adverbial expression formed from a proper name or noun, which appears to refer to a compound substance, namely Trump, it does not eliminate all apparent reference to compound substances. Thus, the paraphrase in question is unacceptable. The response might be that it is extremely plausible that Trump is the president in virtue of an arrangement of basic particles in space-time. And therefore, the difficulty of formulating a transparent version of this proposal is merely a practical or pragmatic one. That is, our inability to paraphrase away the apparent reference to Trump is due to limitations in our knowledge, but such apparent reference can be paraphrased away in principle. But such a response appears to overlook the fact that Trump could be the president in virtue of many possible arrangements of basic particles in space-time. The paraphrase's equivalence with the original requires a disjunctive statement with as many disjuncts as there are possible arrangements. How many disjuncts would be needed? Incalculably many, infinitely many, given the standard view that space-time is mathematically continuous. So imagine there'd be this arrangement and another one that's very slightly different from it, and others in between those two, and so on, depending on the gravitational field. So there'd be an infinite number, given a mathematically continuous space or time. Thus, there is no significant prospect of anybody ever being able to paraphrase away apparent reference to Trump. I conclude that the difficulties in formulating such a paraphrase are not merely practical in nature. Arguably, an omniscient being would be able to grasp the requisite paraphrase. Still, the assumption that an omniscient being exists clashes with the naturalism behind such deflationism, namely that only basic particles are real. The notion that some basic particle is omniscient is hardly viable. Another deflationary ontology is Spinozistic. The universe is the only substance. We mistake modes of the universe for substances. An advocate of such an ontology may propose that Trump is the president can be paraphrased as some region of the universe is Trumpish and president-ish. This proposal seems vulnerable to criticisms like those lodged against the earlier proposed paraphrase. Moreover, while the common sense belief that inanimate objects and living things are substances has observational credibility, the notion that the universe counts as a substance does not. No proposed paraphrase based on such a speculative notion has any force. Some claim that theoretical physics entails that a belief in substance is mistaken. It is argued that physics implies an ontology of space-time and events or tropes or particularized qualities. One can reply to such an argument based on the following epistemic principle. This is the last principle on your handout. When the observational basis which epistemically justifies our acceptance of a scientific theory, T, consists of a set of observational data, D1 through Dn, T, the theory, cannot undermine the epistemic justification of every piece of observational data in that set. This principle implies that no justified scientific theory, and by justified I mean epistemically justified, no epistemically justified scientific theory can undermine the epistemic justification of our belief in the observers of the data which justifies our acceptance of that theory. And this includes the human observers, of course. For if we are not justified in believing in the existence of those observers that observe the data that supports our scientific theory, we are not justified in believing in the existence of the data. And if we're not so justified, then the scientific theory is unjustified, since it's not supported by any observed data, contrary to our assumption. Of course, the human observers in question are paradigm examples of individual things or substances, as are any scientific instruments that they employ in their making their observations. So plausibly, no scientific theory can undermine the justification of our folk belief that individual things or substances are real. And that's all I've got to say for today. So I'm happy to take any questions that you might have and open the floor to discussion. Thank you.